It's about depressions and recessions, but I want to start with the rental value and the selling value of land, which is the mechanism that prevents the economy from expanding and causes it to actually shrink in a depression. Depression, cause of depressions, cyclic increase in unemployment. So what causes depressions? What triggers depressions? And that goes for recessions as well, which are simply mild forms of the same thing, depression. The rental value and the selling value of land. What is the actual value of land as opposed to the potential value of land or the potential rent? And if we don't put the land to its full and fullest use, its full potential, or the highest and best use, as they say, the difference between the income you do get and what you pay in wages and interest is the actual rent. And car lots, of course, what you see on the edge of virtually every city in America are a classic example. Now, the potential rent. The potential rent is the income that's left after wages and interest are paid when the site is put to its full potential, the highest and best use. And it's the basis for the selling value, or as they say, fee simple. Nobody sells you a piece of land based on what you're going to use it for. It's what you could use it for, the potential. Now, if I'm going to evaluate land, I say, well, the first thing, if I have some farmland here and I want to know the rental value of it, it would be relatively simple. I would see what it can rent for, especially today with these big trucks that can move buildings and machinery around from farm to farm. I don't have to make any permanent improvements. And so I'm willing to negotiate for 1 year. The higgling of the market is what ultimately sets the value of everything. Now, the rental value of residential land is another story. How much can you charge for a parcel of land without a building for just 1 year? Now, maybe you could rent it out for people who want to go camping or something like that, if it's a good location. But without any buildings, without any permanent improvements, it would not reflect what the potential of the land is. In other words, how much above and beyond the return to labor and capital would the land yield if it were developed to its fullest potential? But there is a way. And in the case of residential land, I simply find a building lot and I go to my local modular home dealer and I say, gee, can you deliver me a house? And by the time I get the foundation and everything done and the site prepared, and he delivers the truck, I've invested $150,000. My local rental agent says, well, I can get you $1,200 a month for that, or $14,400 per year. And if the current rate of interest is really 3%, then I would have $4,450 in income. But I should mention that if that if inflation were 1%, and let's say that mortgages were being issued at 4%, with the expectation of 1% inflation, then I don't have to worry about the inflation, because inflation is the loss of value in the money. And I haven't invested money, I've invested in a building. And the building is going to be worth 1% more if there's 1% inflation. So all I have to worry about is the 3% return on the building, if that's the current rate of interest after subtracting for inflation. $4,500. Maintenance, 1.6% of the building value. Well, everybody would say that's way more than you need to maintain a building for 1 year. But I haven't allowed anything for depreciation. And some people would say for a good bit of the life of a building that 1.5% a year might be appropriate. But at any rate, I've allowed 1.6% of the building value without any depreciation. and that would be $2,400 a year. I'll get a little insurance policy for the 0.3% or $450 a year. I'll hire managers at 1.23% of the building value. Now, in this area in Delaware, they usually charge you 10% of the income from a rental house and 1 month's rent every time they find you a new tenant, which is on average about every 3 years. So that's $1,845. Now, of course, it isn't really a percentage of the income, and it isn't really a percentage of the value of the building. It's the prevailing rate of wages. But by my calculations, that's about the same as 12.8% of the income or 1.23% of the building value. And now when we look, we say, well, we still have, out of that $14,400, we still have $5,205 left. What do we call that? And clearly that is what they're paying for the location, for the land value. And so we know that's the actual rent from this. If that were the reality, we'd say that's the actual rent, but we don't know if that's the potential rent. And the potential rent's really what we want to know and what the selling price of land is based on. So we start and we say, what would a $250,000 house, how much land rent could I get if I put that on there? And my rental agent says that'd be $1,800 a month or $21,600 a year. And I go through the percentages of interest on the building, maintenance, management, insurance, and I end up with $6,275. Well, that's a lot more than $5,000. But just to be sure, let's put a $350,000 house on this lot. $2,100 per month or $25,200 per year. I do the same thing with the percentages as my expenses, as my return to labor and capital, and I get $3,745. Well, that's less than $5,000 and it's less than $6,000. So what I know is that the potential rent of this land, or as we say around this area, the rental value of this land is somewhere around $6,275. Now, clearly it could be it could be whatever I can get from a $200,000 or a $300,000 house, but I know it's somewhere in between the $150,000 and the $350,000 house. And so I'm going to just suggest that it's around $6,275 that can be accomplished with a $250,000 building and other improvements. Now, what's tricky, of course, in appraising land values based on the potential of the houses is that in this area, there's many houses that are 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 years old. So you have a little trouble knowing how much to depreciate houses like that. Their value certainly hasn't fallen as much as it would take an 80 to, if you had an 80-year-old house and you said, how much would it cost to make it look like brand new? They wouldn't depreciate that much. On the other hand, how much do you knock off the value of a house because it's out of style? So it's very hard to find the exact examples. And I suppose you'd have to start with houses that are a couple of years old or something to really find the market for this in terms of the potential. Few of the buildings that make the market here are even less than 10 years old. And so it's not as easy as it sounds with the modular home delivery, but that's clearly the basis of it. Now, why do people want to buy land instead of just renting it? And of course, the answer is relatively simple. They want to make sure that nobody's going to raise their rent. If the landlord raises the rent precipitously, or too much, it's not so easy to move the buildings to another location where they can get a better deal. So the next step is to say what determines the value of things that can be reproduced, because what I want to find out is what about the value of things that can't. But if something can be reproduced, then it's really the cost of reproduction. And a house, a building is a classic, a perfect example of that. It's whatever it would cost to make another one just like it. And then the tricky part is how much do you take off for wear and tear. But things that can't be reproduced, like a Rembrandt, a taxi cab medallion, or a parcel of land. A Rembrandt clearly has a value based on whatever anybody's willing to pay for it rather than give it up, not pass it by. And I guess the more billionaires there are, the more Rembrandts kind of go for. But a taxi cab medallion or a parcel of land have an income stream. And so you say, well, how is an income stream converted into a selling price? And the answer is capitalization. Capital can be reproduced, and capital has an income. Capital has a value that is equal to the cost of reproduction, and it has an income interest. So a source of income will exchange for the same value as capital yielding the same income. And I'll give it to you in an example rather than try and explain it again. So let's say that we have a parcel of land and it yields $110 a year. And I'm going to say $110 per 1,000 square feet to make it plausible. And there's $10 levied on it every year by the government for taxes. And so the unearned income from this land is $100. The owner of this land enjoys $100 income every year. And if the current rate of interest is 10%, then 10%, 100 is 10% of $1,000. And if the income, which is more realistic, is 5%, then 100 is 5% of $2,000. So the lower the interest rate, the higher the selling price. Now, nobody buys land at a price based on its current income. If you could buy land for a price based on its current income, then it would simply be a matter of how quickly you want to pay off the principal. But generally, the income and the price go up with expectations. And I've often thought there's really no way to scientifically determine the value of any piece of land, the selling value, what somebody will pay for a piece of land, because the person who has the greatest expectation about the future income and enough money to outbid everybody else is going to set the value of land. Now you can see that most land increases in value as population increases, as the infrastructure is extended, as inventions, innovations come along. And I should say that inventions and innovations always increase the best land, the land where population is dense, more than they increase the land where population is sparse. And so that's why the benefits of invention always accrue mostly to the owners of land. Now, even in the slums where expectations of income are going down, we would say that the selling price of land is based on an expectation of reduced income. So it's a speculative value kind of in reverse. So you say, well, why would people be willing to buy land at some speculative price? And let's go back to our $100 unearned income. This is the income we expect the first year from the parcel of land. Here it is in a list. we expect a 10% increase in the value of the land every year for at least the next 10 years. Beyond that, we're kind of not so confident about the future, but for the next 10 years, we really are pretty confident that it will increase at about 10% a year. So the first year it's 100, but then the next year it's 110, 121, and it goes up 10% each year until the 10th year, it'll be $236. Now, to make this simple, let's just say, we add it all up and it's $1,594 instead of $1,000, which it would be 10 times 100. So now it just so happens that you have $3,188 in the bank. And let's say they're paying 5% interest. So they're paying you $159.40 every year. The first year, you would get $159, and the same the second, and everything. For 10 years, you get the same income. You might be living on that income. At the end of 10 years, you would have gotten $1,594, exactly what you expect you would get if you own the land. Of course, owning the land means you have to invest in buildings and other improvements, and you have to maintain it and so on. But even after you've paid for the labor and capital on the land, you will get an additional $1,594 in over 10 years. So if you figure I'm giving up $159 every year, but I'm getting 100, and ultimately in 10 years, I will have gotten the same amount, $1,594. And then you look and you say, well, the first year I'm going to lose $59. In the second year, I will have lost 109, and the third year, 147, and so on, until the sixth year when it starts to decline, and I'm only going to lose 185 instead of 186 the year before. And ultimately, I will break even at the 10th year. So I will gain as much from the land as I did from the bank in 10 years. I will build my buildings. And if this trend continues for one more year even, I'll be $100 ahead. And of course, to make it plausible, I've said $100 per thousand. So the land buyer would get the same income as the bank yields and an increase in the selling price, assuming the prediction is correct. The buyer had to add buildings in order to get the land rent. The seller was just holding the land idle. What the seller was getting was the annual increase in the selling price. The same income as the guy who sold the land to. But remember, the land seller wasn't actually getting any income, only the increase in the value of his land. The speculator who didn't sell gets the full increase in the selling price. And I should mention that the real estate comes out of the increase in the selling price. So if the price of the land that you're holding goes up 10%, but the real estate tax is 1%, well, then you're only getting a 9% return on your asset. But most places, it's a lot less than 1% for 1 year, especially in places like Delaware, not counting the Ardens. So how did the people who bought land in 2006 before the recession make out? In case anybody forgot, house prices fell by an average of 18% from 2008 to 2010. Residential land values fell between 30 and 50%. So land speculation is high stakes gambling. And every homeowner and every business owner is forced to pay a speculative price for the land when they buy a house or a business. With inflation, those who are lucky and have a fixed rate mortgage will ultimately get their land for almost nothing because inflation will eat up what they owe. The mortgage rate is fixed and the value keeps increasing as the value of money goes down. While others, like those who bought houses and businesses in 2006, lose between 30 and 50% of what they paid for the land. And we heard stories about Florida where people lost 90 and in some rare cases, even 100% of what they paid for the land they bought. In other words, they bought a house and just a few years later, they went to sell the house and the land, and they couldn't even get for the house and the land what it cost to build the house. That's why when you say all the land value was gone. And it didn't last, but those who couldn't make the payments, they lost. They lost everything they paid for the land. Now I'm going to start on today's point about the recession of 1873. First, we have a major public works, or whatever you call it, infrastructure accomplishment between the Mediterranean Sea in 1869 and the Red Sea. There's Egypt. And the Suez Canal. It reduced the distance from North Atlantic to the North Indian Ocean by 5,500 miles, or 10 days. And I don't know if that was with sailing ships or steamships, because by then I'm sure they had quite a few of both. But that's a significant savings. And May 10th, 1869, we had at Pommel Terry Summit, Utah, the Transcontinental Railroad was complete. They drove the Golden Spike, and now the railroad from St. Louis to Sacramento, California was complete, and you could go all the way across the United States by railroad. Before the railroad, the stagecoach took 6 months to go across the country, and in today's dollar, it cost you $20,000. You could spend money months going from St. Louis to San Francisco by wagon, or you could spend 3 months going by ship around the bottom of South America. Later, you could get one ship down to Panama, go across the jungle to the Pacific Ocean, and get another ship up to San Francisco, and it only took 2 months. Once the 1,776 miles of railroad was completed from St. Louis to Sacramento, it took just 7 days. It took 21,000 workers, and in today's dollars, it cost more than 1.2 billion. But it brought California into the world. It was no longer isolated 1,000 miles from 1,700 miles from St. Louis, the gateway to the West until that time. And it created a national and a continental economy. Western food crops and raw materials went east. Manufactured goods from the east went west. The railroad facilitated international trade. The first freight train to travel eastward from California brought a load of Japanese tea. The Constitution provided free trade within the states or between the states, and the railroad delivered the goods. The United States became the single largest market in the world, which stimulated the rapid expansion of industry and agriculture. And it spawned towns and hamlets that facilitated the migration of European immigrants throughout the Western United States. It decimated time and distance and made possible the mail order catalog business of Montgomery Ward, the precursor to Sears and Amazon. The railroads were given land, and the government guaranteed their bonds up to a certain amount for each mile of track they completed. The railroads were able to pay lower interest rates because the government guaranteed the return on the bonds. They built trestles, they built tunnels. There was a railroad building frenzy, and the bonds were sold across the ocean. By 1873, around 130 million acres of land were guaranteed to the railroads as a bounty for building the railroads. plots that alternated on either side of the tracks added up to about 12,800 acres per mile, linear mile of track. The railroad would get this 12,000 acres, and then the government would retain 12,000 acres. And then the railroad would get another 12,000, and the government would retain 12,000, and so on, like a checkerboard. And the rationalization on the part of the government was that the land they retained would more than double in value as a result of its proximity to the railroad. And the logic to me is perfect. The land was worth virtually or almost nothing before the railroad came through, much of it. It probably was a terrible deal on the part of the government, but still the rationalization that the land they retained would increase in value as a result of the railroad, I think, was correct. And once the tracks were built, the railroad could sell the plots, and every time the population in any one of these little communities increased, the rest of the land which they had for sale would increase in value. And so the railroad thought of it as a wonderful deal and were able to sell stock in their companies based on the value of their assets. Between 1868 and 1873, 33,000 miles of railroad tracks were laid within the United States. That's 10 times the distance from New York to California. The Transcontinental Railroad connects San Francisco with New York, but I want to go just hypothetically 100 miles south, where somewhere in the middle of this route. And we have an investor who owns 10,000 acres 100 miles south of the route of the east-west line. There is a proposed trunk line, as there were many, many of them, going north and south, connecting the east-west railroad. And let's say that our investor has divided the land up in 160-acre homesteads. But this trunk line that runs north and south and is proposed to go right through his 10,000 acres is not scheduled to be built basically for 5 more years. Now, it takes a good day or maybe 2 to go 100 miles north with a load of grain to put it on the railroad siding, and then another day or 2 to get back to your homestead. So our investor says, well, I would sell now, maybe on a price based on what the land will yield in 5 years or so when the railroad connector is being built, but I'm not going to sell now for what people can offer me, because the homesteaders don't have the money to gamble in the future. They can only offer a price based on what the land will yield right now. More roads continue to be built, and as they are, productivity and expectations of future productivity are going up. The railroad industry is second only to agriculture, second only to growing food. The railroads are employing Irish and Chinese immigrants, and inventions are increasing the results of labor, freeing workers to produce other things. Barbed wire reduces the number of cowboys who can now work at other occupations. Dynamite reduces the amount of people who are needed to build the railroad, to dig the tunnels, to make the cuts and fills. Air brakes on the train are reducing the number of brakemen, grossly reducing the number of brakemen. The stock ticker is facilitating the sale of stock and bonds from the railroads. The cable car probably didn't do too much except in San Francisco. It eliminated a lot of horses that were being abused. And the railroad knuckle coupler in 1873 gave the expectation of far less brakemen and trainmen. And the direct current electric motor gave another expectation that we could have things like subways and so on, where electric would be really important. So every new railroad line, every invention increased the value of land. As it did, more and more land was held for speculation, waiting for the price to go up even more. So much land was held for speculation that the economy could not expand as expected, and the income from the railroads never met the expectation. The railroads were building track and selling bonds to finance it, but a point came when they couldn't pay the interest on the bonds, and many of the banks that were marketing the sale of the bonds went broke. Many of the railroads went broke. Credit shrunk to a fraction of what it had been. Then many of those who wanted to buy land for farming and every other kind of production could not borrow money and could not get access to land. Now, I should say, stop in for a second and say, remember, if these investors, these land speculators who had land for sale, had just sold for whatever they were being offered, people could have acquired land and production could have continued on. But too many of those who held land refused to sell. And my logic tells me that they were waiting for other people to sell, just the way it seems nowadays when there's a recession. They're waiting for somebody else to sell. And once somebody else sells, the economy can resume and land prices can recover. And now I can sell my land for the highest price I thought it might be worth. New immigrants were without work. Inventions were replacing workers who now had no opportunity to work and produce. And the demand for consumer products shrunk from a lack of anything to produce them with, to purchase them with. I'll read my own script here right in the second try. Manufacturers laid off workers, and those workers bought less consumer products, culminating in a depression. By 1878, 10 to 15% of the population were unemployed in what was called the Great Depression. And it was called that until the next depression, which was even greater in 1930s. Wages fell and the depression lasted for 5 years, from 1873 to 1878. Inventions went on and more railroads were slowly completed, including the North-South Railroad through our investors' 10,000 acres. Land speculators began to sell for the highest bid, highest amount being offered. The economy recovered and expanded. In 1880, oranges from California were sent by train east. And by 1890, 12 years later, the United States had become the greatest economy in the world.